The summer of 1885 had turned Silver Mesa into a furnace of dust and silence. The desert wind never stopped its restless moan across the sand flats, carrying with it the scent of sage and the faint rattle of distant storms. It was a small town then, a cluster of weathered wooden buildings crouched between red canyons and endless sky, where every man carried a story and every woman carried a burden. Clara Whitmore had come west from Boston, trading lace gloves and piano evenings for a blackboard in a crooked little schoolhouse on the edge of nowhere. Folks called her the schoolmarm, though she was barely 26. She had a quiet grace about her, the kind that made men tip their hats but keep their distance, for her eyes held a sadness that didn't invite conversation. She had lost her fiancé in the war back east, and the West was her escape, a place to forget, or perhaps to begin again. That evening, the sun was sinking behind the mesas, painting the world in molten gold. Clara was walking home from the schoolhouse, her books tied with string, when she noticed something strange down by Willow Creek, a movement among the reeds. At first she thought it might be one of the rancher's cattle that had strayed too far, but as she stepped closer she froze. A man lay half submerged in the muddy water, bare-chested, bleeding from a gash along his ribs. His hair was long and black, braided in the Apache style, and an arrow shaft stuck out from his shoulder. His breathing came shallow and ragged, his skin feverish even from a distance. Clara's first instinct was fear. The town had been uneasy for months, whispers of raids, broken treaties, and riders vanishing in the desert. The very name Apache sent shutters locking and rifles cocking. But as she stood there, the dying man let out a soft, broken sound. Not a war cry, not a threat, but something that sounded achingly human. She dropped her books and knelt beside him. "Good Lord," she whispered. "You're hurt bad?" He tried to rise, his eyes wild and wary, but his strength gave out. Clara pressed a trembling hand to his chest. "Don't move, you'll make it worse." He stared at her, breathing hard, mistrust burning behind his exhaustion. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "Go, leave." But she didn't. Something in her heart, something that had been cold for years, stirred to life. Maybe it was compassion, maybe it was rebellion, she didn't know. What she did know was that she couldn't walk away. "I won't leave you here to die," she said firmly. It took all her strength to help him to his feet. He was tall, taller than any man she'd met, and though half-conscious, he leaned heavily on her as they stumbled toward her small cabin just beyond the cottonwoods. The walk seemed endless, her skirt soaked and torn, her shoulder aching under his weight. Twice he almost fell, and twice she caught him whispering, "Just a bit farther, you'll be safe soon." When they finally reached her cabin, she eased him onto her bed and went straight to fetch hot water and cloth. The sight of the wound made her heart lurch. The arrow had to come out, but she'd never done anything like that before. Still, she set her jaw. "Out here, a person learned to survive by trying. Hold still," she told him softly. He didn't answer, but his eyes, dark, sharp, and proud, locked on hers as she snapped the shaft and drew the arrow free in one motion. His jaw clenched, but he didn't cry out. Blood welled up, and she pressed a cloth hard against it until the bleeding slowed. Then she stitched the wound with shaking hands, muttering prayers under her breath. Hours passed. The storm outside grew wild, lightning flashing over the mesa, wind howling against the shutters. Inside, Clara worked silently, tending his wounds, changing the bandages, coaxing him to drink water. When it was done, she sat beside him, watching his chest rise and fall, half afraid he'd stop breathing before morning. She didn't sleep that night. Her mind spun with questions. Who he was, what had happened, what would become of her if the town found out she had sheltered an Apache. She could almost hear the whispers already. The school teachers gone soft in the head, helping the enemy. But when she looked at him lying there, pale and motionless, the anger and fear faded. He was no monster. He was just a man, wounded, hunted, and alone. By dawn, the storm had passed. The desert lay washed clean, the air sharp and clear. Clara brewed coffee and sat by the bed, wondering if he'd live long enough to wake. Then, as the first light spilled through the window, his eyes opened. For a moment, he looked confused, then wary, his gaze flicking around the small cabin before settling on her. "You help me?" he asked, his English careful but broken. She nodded. "You were near death. I couldn't leave you there." He was silent for a long time, then said quietly, My name is Taza. Clara, she replied. Taza, she repeated it under her breath, testing the sound. It suited him, strong, simple, and honest. For days she cared for him in secret. She told the town she'd caught a fever and needed rest, which kept the curious away. Taza was quiet, respectful, never asking for more than water or a bit of bread. He spent hours staring out the window at the horizon, as though listening to something far away. One afternoon, when his fever broke, Clara asked him how he'd been hurt. He looked down at his hands. Outlaws, he said at last. White men. They ride with stolen horses. They kill my kin and say it was war. My brothers fight back and they call us savage. His eyes lifted to hers. You believe that? Clara hesitated, feeling the weight of generations between them. I believe there's good and evil in all kinds of men, she said softly. That made him smile, faintly but enough to show she had reached something inside him. As days turned to weeks, an unspoken rhythm settled between them. She'd read aloud from her books, old stories of courage and love, and though his English was limited, he listened intently, his gaze never leaving her face. Sometimes he'd speak of the desert, of places she'd never seen, of the spirits that lived in the wind, of how every stone had a story. And sometimes, in the quiet between words, she'd catch herself staring at him too long, at the scar on his shoulder, the calm strength in his hands, the strange peace that seemed to radiate from him. Something was changing, slowly, quietly, dangerously. One night, as the crickets sang and the fire flickered low, Taza said, When I heal, I go. My people wait. The words struck her harder than she expected. Of course, she murmured, forcing a smile. That's what you should do. But when she turned away, her hands trembled. For the first time in years, she realized how lonely she'd been, and how much she didn't want him to go. She lay awake long after he'd fallen asleep, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, and the wind outside whispering through the cottonwoods. Somewhere deep in her heart, a truth was stirring, one she wasn't ready to face, and yet even then she knew. This wounded stranger had already changed everything. The days slipped by like sand through Clara's fingers, and before she knew it, summer had mellowed into the soft gold of early autumn. The cottonwoods along Willow Creek turned pale yellow, their leaves shimmering in the wind like bits of sunlight. Life in Silver Mesa rolled on. Men mended fences, women baked pies for the harvest fair, and the church bell tolled each Sunday, calling the faithful to prayer. Yet behind the shutters of her small cabin, Clara Whitmore was hiding something that could ruin her. Taza had grown stronger. The wounds that once bled and burned were now only scars, reminders of the night she found him. He worked quietly around the cabin, chopping wood, mending the roof, drawing water from the well. He said little, but his presence filled the space in ways Clara had never known before. His movements were deliberate and graceful, like a man who understood the earth better than words. At first, she told herself she helped him because it was right, because no one deserved to die alone in the dust. But as the weeks passed, that simple kindness deepened into something far more dangerous. It began with the small things, the way he'd pause to listen when she read aloud, the rare, fleeting smiles that reached his eyes, the quiet moments when their hands brushed while passing a bowl or a cup. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It was charged, alive. One morning, she stepped outside to find him standing shirtless in the sunlight, washing at the well. His skin gleamed bronze, and the muscles along his shoulders rippled as he lifted the bucket. The sight startled her, not because it was improper, but because of the warmth it stirred within her. She turned quickly, flustered. He must have noticed, for he smiled faintly. You look red in face, he said, his English hesitant but teasing. Clara laughed despite herself. The sun, perhaps, but she knew it wasn't the sun. Later that afternoon, as she sat by the window correcting school papers, she heard him humming, a low, haunting tune that sounded like the wind between the cliffs. She watched him through the open door, sitting on the porch carving something from wood. His hands were sure patient. What song is that? She asked. He paused, looking up at her. Old song. From my mother. She sang to the stars, and so they listen. There was a tenderness in his voice that made her chest ache. It's beautiful, she whispered. He nodded once, then held out the carving he'd been shaping. It was a small wooden bird, a sparrow, wings spread as if caught in mid-flight. The detail was astonishing. For you, he said simply. Clara took it carefully, feeling the smoothness of the wood. It's perfect. He smiled again, softer this time. You keep it. When wind blows, you remember my people. They ride with wind. She didn't know what to say, so she just nodded, her throat too tight for words. That night, a storm rolled over the desert, fierce and wild. Thunder echoed through the canyon walls, and rain beat against the cabin roof like drumming hands. The fire flickered low, casting long shadows across the walls. Clara sat by the hearth, reading from a book of poems, her voice barely rising above the storm. When lightning flashed, she saw Taza glance toward the window, tense. Instinct, she thought. A man who'd lived through too many ambushes. You don't like storms? She asked softly. He shook his head. Storms are not the enemy. But they remember things, like men do. Old battles, old cries. She closed her book and studied him. His face was calm, but his eyes were distant, as if he were seeing ghosts in the firelight. What are you thinking of? He hesitated, then answered quietly. Of home, of my brother. He died last winter. White men came with guns, said we stole cattle. He was only hunting deer. Clara's breath caught. I'm so sorry, Taza. He shrugged, though his voice trembled slightly. Death walks with us all. But you are not like them. You help me when you should fear me. I don't fear you, she said, and meant it. He looked at her long and hard, as if weighing that truth. Then, with a voice barely more than a whisper, he said, You should. Lightning flared, illuminating the room in stark white. Their eyes met. Hers full of compassion, his full of sorrow and something deeper, something forbidden. Clara rose and crossed the small space between them. Why do you say that? She asked. Taza's jaw tightened. Because your world and mine cannot walk the same road. But for now, she said softly, we're on the same one. For a long moment, neither spoke. The rain softened, and the only sound was the crackle of firewood. Then Taza reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and brushed a lock of hair from her cheek. His touch was gentle, reverent almost, as though he feared she might vanish. Her heart hammered. She could smell the rain on his skin, the faint scent of cedar smoke from his hands. Clara, he began, but stopped, his breath catching. She wanted to tell him not to stop, not to hold back, but she couldn't. Words failed them both. The moment lingered like the stillness after a storm, fragile and dangerous. Then he dropped his hand and turned away. Good night, he murmured. And just like that, the distance between them grew again. Invisible, but heavy. Over the next few days, Clara noticed the change. He spoke less, his eyes shadowed. When she tried to draw him into conversation, he deflected gently, helping with chores or walking off toward the creek alone. It hurt, though she tried not to admit it. The townsfolk began to whisper too. Old Mrs. Carver, who sold flour and gossip in equal measure, mentioned that she'd seen a dark figure near Clara's land. Sheriff McGraw asked if she'd noticed any strangers passing through. Clara smiled and lied with a steadiness that surprised her. That night, she told Taza about the sheriff's visit. You cannot hide me long, he said quietly. Your people will turn against you. Let them, she answered, surprising even herself. You've done nothing wrong. He studied her face, searching for deceit, and found none. His gaze softened. Why do you care? She hesitated, then whispered, Because I see who you are, not what they call you. The words hung in the air like a confession. Taza's breath hitched, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. For a heartbeat, it felt as if the world had narrowed to the space between them. He leaned forward, his voice barely audible. A heart that feels too much has no words, he said, and then, before she could reply, he rose and stepped outside into the night, leaving her staring after him, trembling, confused and utterly alive. Later, alone by the window, Clara clutched the little wooden sparrow in her hands. The wind whispered through the trees, and she thought of his words, of his pain, his honor, his quiet strength. She pressed the carving to her chest, feeling her heart pound. Somewhere deep inside, she knew what she was falling into, a love that could destroy her, or save her completely. But out here, beneath the endless desert sky, Clara Whitmore had never believed in half measures, and so she whispered to the night, her voice trembling, If loving him is madness, then let me be mad forever. Autumn deepened over Silver Mesa, painting the desert in shades of copper and gold. The mornings came cool now, with thin ice forming on the edges of the creek and the evenings burned red beneath the setting sun. Life in the small town beat to its usual rhythm. Church bells on Sunday, wagons rattling down Main Street, cattle drives rumbling through the valley. But beneath the calm surface, trouble was brewing. It began with a rumor, the kind that spreads like wildfire in dry grass. Someone had seen smoke near the old mine south of town. Another claimed that horses had been stolen from a ranch along the river. Then, one evening at the saloon, a drunk ranch hand swore he'd seen a pair of Apaches riding through the hills at sundown. The sheriff didn't waste time. He gathered a posse and sent word that anyone sheltering strangers would be questioned. Fear crept through Silver Mesa like a cold wind, and with fear came suspicion. Clara Whitmore heard it all from behind the counter at Mrs. Carver's store. The women whispered in sharp, eager tones, how they'd always thought the schoolteacher was odd, how she kept to herself, how she might even be hiding something. Clara's hands shook as she folded her purchases. She smiled politely, but her mind was already racing. She hurried home, her boots kicking up dust, her heart pounding. Taza was splitting logs behind the cabin when she arrived. The moment he saw her face, his expression hardened. "What happened?" he asked. "They know someone's out there," she said breathlessly. "They're looking, Sheriff McGraw and half the town. They'll come here next." He dropped the axe, straightening. The setting sun cast a glow over his skin, highlighting the scars that marked his shoulder. "Then I go," he said simply. "No." Clara reached for him before she could think. "If you leave now, they'll find you. They'll kill you." He looked down at her hand on his arm, small, pale, trembling. Slowly he took it in his and gently lowered it. "If I stay, they hurt you. Taza, please." But he only shook his head, his jaw set in that quiet, immovable strength she'd come to know. "I will not bring war to your door." That night the wind blew hard against the shutters. Clara sat by the fire staring into the flames, her thoughts in turmoil. Outside, Taza moved silently through the darkness, packing what little he had, a blanket, a knife, a piece of flint. When he came back inside, she stood and faced him. "You can't just walk out there. You're not healed enough. You'll freeze," he smiled faintly. "The desert keeps her own children warm." She wanted to argue, but the words tangled in her throat. Instead, she crossed the room, standing so close she could feel his warmth. "You saved me," she whispered. "That night when you came here. You gave me back something I'd lost. I can't just let you go." He looked at her for a long moment. His hand lifted, hesitant, and then brushed a tear from her cheek. "You have a good heart, Clara. But your world and mine are rivers that run apart." Her eyes met his, defiant, desperate. "Maybe they don't have to." Before he could answer, the sound of horses echoed in the distance, the sharp rhythm of hooves against hard earth. Clara froze. Taza's head snapped toward the door, his instincts sharpening. "They're coming," she breathed. He reached for his knife. "Hide me." She pointed toward the cellar trap door beneath the rug. He slipped inside without another word, and she pulled the rug back just as the knock thundered against the door. "Miss Whitmore," Sheriff McGraw's voice rang out. "Open up." Clara took a deep breath, smoothed her hair, and opened the door. The sheriff stood there, flanked by two deputies, their lanterns cutting through the night. "Evening, ma'am," McGraw said, tipping his hat. "We're checking all properties near the creek. Word is one of those Apache fellas might be hiding around these parts." Clara forced a calm smile. "I've heard the talk, Sheriff, but I'm afraid you won't find any warriors here. Only schoolbooks and leaky roofs." The sheriff chuckled, but his eyes were sharp. "Mind if we take a look around?" Her heart nearly stopped. "Of course," she said quietly. They stepped inside, boots thudding on the floorboards. The deputies poked around, checked behind the curtains, under the bed, even glanced in the pantry. Clara stood near the table, gripping its edge so tightly her knuckles turned white. When one of them moved toward the rug, she acted on instinct. "Sheriff," she said quickly, "you must be thirsty after all that riding. Let me pour you some water." McGraw paused, half turning toward her. "Well, that's mighty kind." She hurried to the pitcher, pouring with trembling hands, praying they wouldn't notice the slight bulge in the rug. The sheriff took the cup, his gaze flicking around the room one last time. "Ma'am," he said finally, "if you see anything, anyone, you come straight to me. You understand?" Of course, they left. The sound of hooves faded slowly into the night. Only when the silence settled did Clara let out the breath she'd been holding. Her knees nearly gave way. She knelt and lifted the trapdoor. Taza climbed out, his face unreadable in the flickering firelight. "You lied for me," he said quietly. "I saved you," she corrected. He shook his head, looking at her as if he didn't know whether to be grateful or angry. "They will turn on you if they learn truth." "I don't care," she said. He stepped closer, his voice low and fierce. "You should care. You belong to them, your people, your laws, not to me." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Then tell me, Taza, what do I belong to?" For a long, breathless moment, he said nothing. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, he answered, "To your heart." Something broke inside her then, the last thread of restraint. She reached for him, and before either could stop it, he caught her in his arms. His lips met hers in a kiss that was fierce and tender all at once, the kind that carried all the words they'd never dared to speak. When they finally drew apart, she was trembling. "Taza," she whispered. "If they find you," he silenced her with a finger to her lips. "If they find me, I face them, but not tonight." He glanced toward the window where the moonlight spilled across the floor. "When dawn comes, I go." Clara didn't sleep that night. She sat by the window watching him as he rested on the floor near the fire, his face peaceful in the glow. Every so often she'd reach out and trace the air above him, afraid to touch but unable to look away. When morning came, the desert was wrapped in soft mist. Taza rose quietly, shouldered his blanket, and turned to her. "Thank you," he said simply. Her throat closed. "Where will you go?" "South," he said. "To my people. To peace, if it still lives," she nodded, fighting tears. "Will I ever see you again?" He didn't answer right away. Then softly, "When the wind carries your name to me, I will know." She took a step toward him, her voice trembling. "Taza, wait." He turned back, his eyes burning with emotion he couldn't hide. For a heartbeat, he seemed to struggle. Then he said the words that would haunt her long after he was gone. "Don't fight for me. Clara, the world will never understand." And before she could speak, he was gone, disappearing into the pale dawn, his figure swallowed by the endless desert. Clara stood at the doorway long after he vanished, the wooden sparrow clenched in her hand, her heart breaking and blooming all at once. Some loves, she realized, didn't belong to the world at all. They belonged to the wind, and wild, untamed, and unforgettable. Winter came early to Silver Mesa that year. By December, the desert winds turned sharp and frost clung to the corners of the windows each dawn. The cottonwoods stood bare along Willow Creek, their skeletal branches scratching at the sky. It had been 3 months since Taza rode away, vanishing into the pale horizon. 3 months since Clara had stood at her doorway and watched the man she loved disappear between the mesas. At first, she'd waited. Each morning, she'd step outside and scan the distant ridges, hoping for the faint outline of a rider. Tall, proud, familiar. But the desert had a way of keeping its secrets. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months, and the trail of her hope grew cold as the earth itself. The townsfolk noticed the change in her. She smiled less, spoke little, and walked as though carrying some invisible weight. Some said she'd taken ill again. Others whispered that the schoolmarm's heart was broken over some man from back east. Clara let them believe what they liked. The truth was too sacred, too dangerous to speak aloud. Still, she kept her secret safe, like an ember hidden under ashes. Every evening, she lit the fire and took out the little wooden sparrow Taza had carved for her. She would hold it gently, tracing its wings with her thumb, listening to the wind outside. Sometimes she fancied it was his voice she heard, the low hum of his song, blending with the rustle of the cottonwoods. It was on a cold morning in February that the letter came. She found it tucked beneath her door, wrapped in a piece of deerskin, and sealed with a strip of rawhide. There was no name on it, but she knew before she opened it who had sent it. Her hands trembled as she sat by the fire, breaking the seal. Inside was a single sheet of rough paper, written in careful, uneven English. "Clara, I write this from the land of red stone and wind. My people are safe now. The fighting is less. Some of the white men talk of peace. I do not know if it is real, but I hope I remember you. Your eyes, your kindness. You saved my life when the world gave me none. I walk each day and think of that night you stood before me when the guns came. You are brave. I cannot come to Silver Mesa. It is not my place. But I send this by a trader who rides north. He will find you if the spirits are kind. When the sun sets behind the cliffs, I see your face in the light. You are in my prayers, not as a dream but as truth. Taza. By the time she finished reading, Clara's eyes were blurred with tears. She pressed the letter to her lips, her heart aching and soaring all at once. He was alive. He was safe. For a long time, she simply sat there, staring into the flames, letting the warmth of his words soak through her. She could almost hear his voice, soft, careful, carrying the rhythm of the desert wind. But along with relief came the hollow ache of distance. He was hundreds of miles away, living among his people while she was trapped here among wagons and whispers. They belonged to different worlds, as he had said, and yet she could not forget him. That night she took up her journal, the same one she had brought from Boston years ago, and began to write. My dearest Taza, she wrote, though she knew the letter might never reach him. You speak of peace, and I pray it finds you. But my peace lies wherever you are. The town believes I am lonely, that I live for nothing but my school and my books. They do not know I live for a memory. For a man the world would never let me love. But the world has never known your eyes, your spirit, your truth. If it did, they would understand why my heart is no longer mine. She stopped there, tears dripping onto the page. Wherever the wind carries this, she whispered, may it find you. Then she blew out the lamp and sat in darkness, her fingers tracing the carved sparrow resting near the letter. Spring came slowly. The snows melted from the hills, and with them, Clara's grief softened into something quieter. Not despair, but longing that lived like breath. She taught her lessons, smiled at her students, and went about her days as before. But every so often, when the sun dipped low behind the red cliffs, she'd pause mid-sentence and stare toward the horizon. The children whispered among themselves that Miss Whitmore was a dreamer. They were right. One afternoon, a rider came from the south, a dusty trader with a weathered face and kind eyes. He stopped by the schoolhouse to water his horse. You're Clara Whitmore? He asked. She nodded, heart quickening. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded scrap of hide. A man gave me this near the San Pedro, tall fella. Dark hair, quiet voice, said if I passed through Silver Mesa I was to give it to the teacher lady. Her breath caught. What did he look like? The man shrugged. Didn't say much, but he smiled when he spoke your name. Clara's hands trembled as she opened the parcel. Inside was not a letter, but something small and simple, a feather bound with a red thread. She closed her eyes. The Apache believed feathers carried messages from the spirits, symbols of truth and connection. And she knew what it meant. I remember. I still walk with you. That evening, as twilight settled over Silver Mesa, she walked down to the creek, the same place she'd found him months ago, half dead and silent. The water shimmered in the fading light. She knelt on the bank and let the feather drift into the current. Wherever you are, she whispered, come back to me. Her voice carried softly through the canyon, lost in the sigh of the wind. That night she dreamed of him. He stood beneath the red cliffs, the wind whipping his hair, his hand outstretched toward her. His lips moved, but no sound came, only the echo of his gaze, deep and endless. When she woke, her pillow was damp with tears, but her heart felt lighter somehow, as if the dream had been a promise rather than a farewell. By summer, peace had come, at least the kind that appears on paper. Word spread that the Apache bands had laid down their arms, that treaties were being honored at last. The army had withdrawn from the nearby fort. For the first time in years, Silver Mesa slept without fear. Still, Clara's nights were restless. She would stand on her porch, the air warm and fragrant with sage, and listen, not for danger, but for something else. The desert was alive with sound, crickets, coyotes, the whisper of the wind in the canyon. And in that wind, she sometimes thought she heard his name, Taza. Each time it made her heart tremble. One evening she sat outside watching the sun set. The sky burned crimson and gold, the kind of light that could make even sorrow look beautiful. She took out his letter, now worn soft from reading, and traced the words with her fingertips. I walk each day and think of that night you stood before me when the guns came. She smiled faintly. And I think of you, she whispered back to the paper. Every sunrise, every storm, every breath. The wind rose gently, lifting a curl of her hair. She closed her eyes and let it move through her fingers. The same wind that touched the mesas. The same wind that carried his songs. Somewhere out there, she knew, he was alive. And somehow that was enough. For now. The next chapter of her story, his wind, was waiting just beyond the horizon. And the desert faithful keeper of their secret seemed to hum with quiet promise. By the time the son of summer 1886 returned to Silver Mesa, Clara Whitmore had learned to live with ghosts. Not the haunting kind, but the gentle, lingering sort that came in the hush of evening or in the whisper of wind across the desert. They lived in her heart, in the quiet corners of her small cabin, in the fragile smile she wore when the world wasn't looking. Each morning, she rose before dawn, lit the stove and brewed coffee as the first light crept over the mesas. She taught her lessons faithfully, tended her garden, and kept her head high when people talked. But her eyes, her soft gray eyes, always drifted toward the horizon, where the land stretched endless and waiting. Silver Mesa had changed in the months since peace had come. Soldiers no longer rode through town. The settlers and the neighboring Apache bands traded more than they fought. The air seemed lighter, as if the desert itself had taken a deep breath after years of holding still. Clara had even seen a few Apache men riding past the edge of town now and then. Proud, straight-backed, unafraid. The first time her heart had leapt, but none of them were him. Still, she smiled each time they rode by, as though through them she could feel his world drawing closer to hers. That afternoon, the heat shimmered like glass above the canyon rim. Clara dismissed her students early. The little ones were drowsy, their faces flushed from the sun. She lingered after they left, tidying her desk and brushing the dust from the floorboards. When she stepped outside, the sun was dipping low, bathing the valley in shades of amber and rose. She walked home along Willow Creek, her skirts brushing against the tall grass. The air smelled of sage and river water, and somewhere far off a hawk cried out. It was the same trail she'd walked so many times, the one that led past the cottonwoods down to the bend where the creek curved west toward the desert. The place where she had once found a wounded man half dead and bleeding beneath the twilight sky. She paused there now, as she always did, and let the memories rise. The sound of his voice, the way his eyes caught the firelight, the words he had said the last time she saw him. "Don't fight for me, Clara. The world will never understand." She smiled sadly. "Oh, Taza," she whispered. "I did fight, only not against the world. Against myself." The water murmured gently at her feet. Somewhere upstream a breeze stirred the reeds. It carried with it the faintest sound, like the rhythm of hooves far away. Clara's heart stilled. She turned her head, listening. The sound came again, steady now, closer. A horse's gait, unhurried but sure. She shaded her eyes against the lowering sun. A rider was coming down the ridge. At first he was only a silhouette against the crimson sky. Tall in the saddle, shoulders broad, hair long and dark. But as he drew nearer, she saw his face. Her breath caught. It was him, Taza. He rode slowly, the reins loose in his hands, his gaze fixed on her. His clothes were different now, a blend of both worlds. A faded army jacket hung open over a deerskin shirt, a turquoise pendant gleaming at his throat. His horse was strong and sleek, its coat the color of burnished copper. When he stopped a few feet away, the world seemed to fall silent. Only the creek's soft gurgle broke the stillness. "Clara," he said at last, his voice rough with travel and emotion. She tried to speak, but her throat closed. The tears came fast and unashamed. "You came back," she whispered. He swung down from the saddle, the motion smooth, familiar. "I told myself I would not," he said quietly. "I told myself your life was here, your people, your home. But every road I walked led me back to this sky. To you." Her hands trembled. "I thought I'd never see you again." He stepped closer, the light catching his eyes, still fierce, still kind. "I did not know peace until I met you. The treaties hold now. My people can walk these lands without chains or guns. The trader who carried my letters told me Silver Mesa is free again." She smiled through her tears. "And you came to see it for yourself?" His lips curved faintly. "I came to see if what I left behind was still waiting." For a heartbeat they stood apart, the teacher and the warrior, the woman and the man who had once belonged to different worlds. Then Clara closed the distance between them. She reached out, her fingers brushing his chest as if afraid he might vanish. "You're real," she breathed. He caught her hand in his and held it to his heart. "I am here," he said softly, "and I am not leaving again." The wind lifted around them, carrying the scent of rain and sage. The sun dipped lower, throwing fire across the desert. Clara looked up at him, her heart overflowing with everything she'd held back for so long. "Why now?" she asked. "After all this time?" Taza's gaze softened. "Because I could not pretend anymore." The words struck deep, echoing through every corner of her soul. He took a breath, his voice barely more than a whisper. "No puedo fingir. Te amo." For a moment all she could do was stare. The Spanish words rolled off his tongue like a prayer. Words she had taught him months ago by the fire, never knowing she'd one day hear them again like this. Her tears fell freely now, a smile trembling on her lips. "You don't have to pretend," she whispered. "I love you too." He exhaled slowly, relief and wonder mingling in his expression. His hands rose to frame her face, calloused and warm. The world around them blurred, the sunset, the wind, the whispering water, until there was only the two of them. When he kissed her, it was like coming home. Later they sat by the creek, the sky turning violet and gold. Taza spoke of his travels, of helping his people rebuild, of the new peace being forged with the settlers. He told her how he'd seen the stars over the desert and thought of her reading by lamplight, how her kindness had followed him through every lonely mile. Clara listened, her hand resting in his, her heart finally quiet. "And now?" she asked softly. He smiled. "Now I stay, not as a stranger, not as a ghost, but as a man who belongs, here, beside you." The words settled between them like a vow. They watched the sun sink behind the red cliffs, its last light reflecting in the water like molten gold. Above them, the first stars began to appear, bright and unafraid. Clara leaned her head on his shoulder. "Do you think the town will understand?" Taza chuckled softly. "Maybe not, but the desert will, and the wind." "That's enough," she smiled. "It's more than enough." He reached into his satchel and pulled something from inside, and a new carving. Another bird. But this one carved from white mesquite, its wings outstretched as if soaring. "He placed it in her hands for you," he said. "A pair for the one I gave before. 2 birds, 1 sky." Her fingers traced its shape and her voice caught with emotion. 2 hearts, she whispered. 1 home. He nodded, his eyes glimmering in the twilight. And as the stars spread across the heavens, Clara Whitmore and Taza sat side by side, the teacher and the warrior, no longer divided by fear or distance, but joined by something greater than either world could name. The creek sang softly at their feet, carrying the last light of the sun toward the endless horizon. And in that golden hour between day and night, they found what they had always been searching for: peace, belonging, and a love that would outlast the desert wind.